Hey, it's Charlie at Charlie's Flybox, and today I'm going to tell you everything I know about fly tying thread, which is a lot, but hopefully it'll help clear up some questions that you might have. Um, how thread is sized and what it's for and why you would use a different thread are those are some of the most common questions I get in classes and demos, and I can completely understand why people have so many questions about thread because it's not very clear. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Um, and I'm not entirely convinced after all this time that it's maybe not even done on purpose, but I'll try to shed some light on the differences between all these different threads that are available these days. And we've just got kind of a cross section of thread. This is not by any means all the thread available in the world. I think I've probably tied with most of the thread available in the world, but this is the stuff that I like. Doesn't make any difference. I'm just going to talk about the differences between them. But let's talk first about size, the size of thread. We back in the day, back in I don't know, I think the 1930s is where Danville came out with 6/0 thread, and that was using the aught system to measure the thread. And where that came from was surgical silks. So 6/0 was 6 zeros. 6/0 thread was, or 6/0 silk, surgical silk, was smaller than 3/0 silk. So 3 zeros was bigger than 6 zeros. Kind of think of that as negatives or kind of descending from zero. That's where the aught system came from. The catch with the aught system is it worked fine for about 50 years while Danville used it, and all the thread was the same brand and it was all measured the same under the same measurement. That aught system worked fine. It was when other companies came in and sort of just there was no baseline for that measurement. So somewhere along in the 90s, I think it was, Uni came along and they had 8/0 thread, which to those of us that had been around before Uni-thread came around, 8/0 thread sounded like it was the smallest thing in the world because it was 8/0, even smaller than 6/0. And we all liked it, and it was a nice thread, and it was good for a lot of stuff. Different kind of thread, but in reality, it really wasn't all that different sized. And finally, here in most recent years, I think UTC is who started it. Ultra Thread Company, which comes from Wapsi, started measuring their thread and labeling their thread with the denier system. So just to clarify there's the aught system of thread measurement and the denier system. Denier or denier, I always say denier. Um, Denier is the thread industry standard of measurement for thread. And that is a physical weight in grams of 9,000 meters of thread. So if you had a spool of thread that said 70 denier on it, it would weigh 70 grams for 9,000 meters. So that gives you a very solid number that can be compared to another thread and give you a reasonable comparison, a better way to measure thread certainly than the 6/0, 6/0, 8/0, 3/0 system that had been around for so long. Um, the catch to it, and I think this is where they kind of throw things off, is the denier system only holds so much weight in the materials that the thread is made out of. So what I mean by that is a nylon thread that's 70 denier could be one strength, one weight, where a polyester thread, because polyester is a little bit heavier material, might be a little bit coarser, might be a little bit heavier actual tying, actual practical use thread. So that's where there's a little catch between those two measurement systems. The aught system isn't used that much anymore these days. It all seems to be measured by denier. Just for the record, to make things fairly easy, if you kind of remember that Danville 6/0 6/0 thread is 70 denier. That will give you sort of a good starting point to where those two methods intersect. The other difference between different kinds of thread are the material that they're made out of. So not only the size of the thread, and again, thread sizes in denier can run. In denier, you've got 70 denier, 140 denier, 210 denier, 280 denier, down to 35 denier for some of like GSP stuff. Um, the nice thing about that is it's a number, it's a weight. So 140 denier thread is going to be twice as big as 70 denier thread. So it's easy to tell which one's the bigger of the two. On aught threads, the less aughts you have, the heavier the thread is. So 6/0 thread is finer than 3/0 thread. It's just not as coarse. That's how that system works. Now, when you get to into the materials that threads are made out of, that's another big part that kind of not only dictates what you'd use the thread for, but where the strength is and how much stretch it has. A lot of thread is made out of nylon, and a lot of thread is made out of polyester. Now I didn't say all thread is made out of either of those two, because there are some different materials, but threads for general use anyway in fly tying are either nylon or polyester. Danville, UTC thread, um, both of those are nylon threads. Nylon threads tend to lay flat like a ribbon. They are not twisted. The configuration is flat like a ribbon. So they tend to lay flat. They've got about 25 to 30% stretch as well. So they lay very, very flat on the hook. They've got a little stretch to them. Versus polyester thread, which is only about maybe 15% stretch, and is a much coarser material. It's a little bit heavier physical weight for the same length. So 9,000 meters is going to weigh a little bit more. So you're gonna have a slightly heavier thread, based on that system. So you've got the size of the thread and the material of the thread, and most importantly, I think, and this is what kind of throws everybody off, is the configuration of the thread. Not all thread is the same. Not all those brands are the same. There's really very little consistency between brands at all. There are essentially two schools of thought. There are flat ribbon-like threads, and then there are round threads that are round like a rope. Cut in, if you cut a cross section, it'd be a circle, versus flat like a ribbon. Danville, UTC, Kevlar, gel spun, nano silk. I'll get to the Mayfly and Veevus thread here in a second, but those are all flat threads. Uni-thread tends to be a round polyester thread, so a corded polyester thread. And I think we've got a graphic that we'll try to put in this article, or in this video, so that you can kind of see a blown up version of what that might look like. But that is the difference between the nylon threads and the polyester threads, for the most part, is the configuration. And there's no hard and fast rule on any of this, because I'm about to show you some polyester thread that's flat. So just to kind of clear things up, I'll do this in order here as we go, just so you can kind of reference this video back to kind of see the differences. If you were to take some 6/0 Danville, which like I say, is the most common, it was the most common thread back in the day. It's still made. It's still very popular. It's still a great thread. There's not a thing wrong with it. But if you took this thread and attached it to a hook, it's going to lay very flat and very smooth on the hook. It's going to be fairly transparent. It's got a good degree of stretch to it. Really nice for thread-bodied flies, or flies with the thread underbody. Anything where you've got where you're going to wrap a smooth, hard material, quill. Even body tubing, things like that, micro tubing. A flat, smooth thread is going to make a nice body for flies like that. One of the downsides of thread that has a lot of stretch, i.e. nylon thread, is it can sometimes not have as much strength, because you kind of pull the stretch out of it. And that's where I think polyester thread kind of comes into its own if you're trying to tie down a little bit harder. But 6/0 Danville is a very flat thread. Just because I've got it sitting here, this is 3/0 Danville, 3/0 monocord, and this may show a little bit better. It's just bigger size thread, same configuration. It's still a very flat thread. You can see it builds up very little on the hook. One of the things I always talk about with nylon thread is it tends to build bulk horizontally on the hook, where a round polyester thread will build bulk vertically. So if you think of stacking a bunch of little beads on the hook, you're going to get a vertical stack with the beads, versus a stack of ribbons or sheet of paper. You're going to get a much flatter stack. So the flat thread is going to lay much more flat on the hook. The round thread is going to be a little bit more round. And of course, yes, you can spin your bobbin with either of these. Luckily I tie left-handed. And that's one of the first things I noticed when I started hanging out with other people that tie, is I tie left-handed. So as I wrap my thread, I unwind any of the factory twist in the thread. So my thread lays very flat. Even round thread will lay pretty flat for me. If you tie right-handed, you contribute to that twist as you wrap your thread. So you've probably noticed, if you make a lot of wraps of thread in a row, with right-handed wraps, your thread starts to cord up and get really wound up tight, and you've got to manage that thread twist by winding or unwinding your bobbin. Typically, when you see me spin my bobbin, it is to wind the thread up rather than to unwind it, because just wrapping the thread will unwind it for me. So 3-aught monocord is a flat thread also, and this thread's been around a long time. I have heard that they've stopped making it. I have not confirmed that for sure, but that's 3-aught monocord is one of my favorite threads for streamers. Um, 3-aught monocord is in the world of denier. I think 135 denier is what 3-aught monocord is. It used to say it on the spool. But yeah, I think that's 135 denier versus 70 denier for the 6-aught, so roughly twice as big. Getting into getting into Uni-thread, and I'm going to use the 6-aught size here, just because I think this is going to illustrate our point a little better. 6-aught Uni-thread is a polyester thread that's round. So when I start this thread, and again, keep in mind my left-handed tying is going to take some of this twist out, but this thread, I'll actually add to this twist just to illustrate this point. This thread tends to be more round like a rope when I wrap it around the hook. So it's got a little bit more vertical bulk, um, not quite as opaque on the, or not quite as transparent on the hook as the flatter threads. Still a good, useful thread, you know, and that's, I say this all the time in class. All thread is good for something. It's just not all good for everything. You know, I have every kind of thread made, and you have specific flies that I like particular kinds and brands of thread for. It's not that you couldn't substitute something else, or you know, another tire might have a different thread for that same fly that they like better. So a lot of it is opinion, but I'm just trying to kind of explain what these differences are. So we've got the size, the material, and the configuration. So flat versus round, nylon versus polyester, and various sizes. They all come in various sizes for the most part. So like I say, this 6-aught Uni is a fairly round thread, and just making a few turns there. We've got some, hopefully some cool graphics that we can throw in here. You know, for the same amount of turns, 6-aught Uni is going to make a much bulkier thread hump or thread head than say 3-aught monocord would, just because the monocord will lay more flat and spread out a little bit more on the hook. Which kind of brings us into some of these newer threads. Maybe before I jump into the newer threads, I'll talk about UTC thread, which is a thread that's been around and kind of changed things a lot. They're the first guys that used the denier system. But UTC thread is a flat nylon thread that is very flat, very ribbony, wraps beautifully on the hook. It's a really nice thread to tie with. Comes in a, you know, or at least historically has come in a huge range of colors. They've not been so great about delivering UTC thread for the last few years in all the colors, but I think there's like 50 colors that it came in at one point anyway. But a very nice, flat, uh, reasonable amount of stretch thread. You know, for any, you know, people say what size thread would you use for that size fly? You know, a 70 denier thread, whether it was you know, 8-aught Uni, 70 denier UTC, or 6-aught Danville, I could use that thread for a size 6 woolly bugger, and I could use it down to a size 20 RS2. It kind of depends on how much thread work you have and where you're doing it. You know, if you're doing a size 20 Royal Wolf, it's probably not the best thread. You'd probably be better off to go to something that's even smaller size, just because you've got a lot of thread work. But if you're tying a size 20 RS2, any one of those would work just fine. Um, just different configurations, and you kind of, you know, find a few different threads that you like. So I mean, don't let your opinion, you know, limit you by any stretch, or don't let my opinion limit you by any stretch. You know, if you have a thread that you like, by all means use it. I'm just trying to explain what the differences are. There's a couple of new threads. Veevus is one. This is Veevus 8-aught, and this is, you know, just to be strange, this is a flat polyester thread, which is unusual. Usually polyester thread is a round corded type of thread, and a nylon thread will be much more flat. Veevus is a pretty flat polyester thread, so less stretch, but still lays flat on the hook. It's one of my favorites. This is 8-aught that I've got attached to this hook right now. And this is, I think, around 110 denier, I think is what this is, if I remember right. You're noticing between these brands, what they call their aught of whatever is not, you would think everybody's 6-aught thread would be about 70 denier, but that is not the case. Don't believe the hype. It's all made up. It's all nonsense. It's all bullshit. They all lie to you. That's the truth of the matter. You've really got to kind of go by the denier of the thread to get an idea of the size, and then really tie with it is how I figured it out. This A dot thread is nowhere, this Veevus A dot thread is nowhere near the same size as Uni A dot thread. Very different. Let me get those tags out of the way. We can get a nice up close picture of that. The Uni thread here toward the front is much more round. This is much more flat. It's much bigger. It's a much wider strand of thread, and it's not just because it's been flattened out. There's no consistency between brands. What one company calls a dot and what another company calls a dot are not necessarily the same thing, and probably are not the same thing at all. So if they feel different to you, it's because they are. They're not the same size threads, even though they're labeled the same. So don't believe that part of it. Not to say that A dot Uni isn't great thread, not to say that A dot Veevus isn't great thread, but not the same size materials, not the same size threads, so not the same applications for either of those. One of my favorite threads that has come around in the last few years is 14-aught Veevus, which sounds super tiny. Everybody says, gosh, how do you tie all those flies with that super tiny 14-aught? You know, that's got to be just tiny, tiny. This is about 70 denier thread also. It is a flat polyester thread. It might be a little bit less than 70 denier. You know, might be a little bit lighter than that. Interestingly, when I wrote this the article that we're talking about, I called the guy that owns Veevus and I asked him about the denier of each of these threads, and he didn't know the answer to that either. And I think their chart listed, they make Veevus thread in I think 8-aught or 6-aught, 8-aught, 10-aught, 12-aught, 14-aught, 16-aught. And like the first four of those were all listed as 70 denier, and the next four were listed as 110. So he listed all those different threads as the same, or the same 2 deniers, which just isn't correct. It can't be. They're very, very plainly different size threads. Interestingly, the 6-aught size Veevus thread and the 16-aught Veevus thread are not the same configuration as the middle sizes of those threads. The 6-aught and 16-aught are both 2 single strands that are twisted together, so it's a 2-strand thread, and it's really corded, and honestly I hate them both. Don't like it at all, but all the middle sizes I very much like. Just not a lot of consistency to it. It's not that it's not good thread. It's great thread. I use it a lot. But again, like I say, not a lot of consistency. And I think for the most part, I think other than UTC, so little of this thread is actually made for our specific purpose. You know, it's repackaged and respooled for our uses. So I imagine that's why there's not as much consistency to it as we'd like to see. But 14-aught thread is a flat polyester thread, just for the record. I've got here from our friend Stephen Hankins some Magpie Materials thread. Let me turn this over. You can see that. Magpie Materials is also a flat polyester thread. And he calls this 72 denier, and I think he did weigh this, so I think he actually did the homework on this, but this is a very flat polyester thread. It's become kind of a go-to thread for me. It comes in a lot of good colors. He's a great guy. We really support him a lot here at the shop. This is really nice thread. If you've not tried it, you might give it a shot. It ties differently than a lot of the other threads. Very similar to 14-aught Veevus. I'd say it might be a touch smaller. I'm a big fan of the 72 denier. It's very small. It allows you to do a lot of thread work without a ton of bulk. It also comes in a 110 denier, which is correspondingly bigger. I like that for bigger size streamers and things like that. Steven uses it for a lot of his larger size dry flies. It's a little big for me for that kind of stuff. I'm just a more delicate tire. In general, I'm not just better looking than him. I'm a more delicate tire also. This big fat thread I reserve for big streamery kind of stuff. You can see just a few turns there, built up some bulk. But apparently he likes that big chunky. He likes them thick. That's just him. Let's see, what have I not covered yet? There's a few other weird threads out there. There's monofil thread. This is Veevus mono thread, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is a monofilament thread. So it's like tippet material. It's just clear tippet material. And this is a round single strand material that is clear on the hook. And you can see, because it's a single strand, I just made 5 turns on there, and that just wound up like crazy and is now unwinding and winding back up and kind of working that twist through it, which is one of the disadvantages of monofilament thread. Is it really twists up and it can bind up really easily, and if you break it, it all comes unwound. but very specific use for flies where you're using resin or epoxy over the top, typically used in saltwater stuff. When you put resin over the top of this thread, it just disappears, so it doesn't show up at all. So you don't have a white thread head. You have just a transparent epoxy sort of glow right there. So very specific use, but monofilament thread does exist, and that's what it's for. And it comes in a couple different sizes. I think this is, yeah, a 0.20, and I think they've got a 0.10, so I think this is the heavier of the two. Um, to get into some of the sort of niche materials, which isn't so niche these days, but this is Simperfly Nano Silk, and I think this is 30 denier. So this is their what they call 18-aught. 30 denier is very small, and again, this is made out of gel spun polyethylene, GSP. And this kind of thread has been around for a long time, but I think Simperfly are the ones that mastered getting this stuff on a spool where you could use most of the spool before it started to tangle up, which was always historically the problem with GSP thread. NanoSilk is great stuff, and Simperfly does make a lot of other kinds of thread, a lot of conventional thread, nylons and polyesters. But their NanoSilk is really kind of where they made their name, and I think where they do the best job. And the attributes of NanoSilk thread or GSP thread in this 30 deniers, it's very, very small. It lays very, very flat, and it is incredibly strong. You just saw one of the disadvantages there. It's very slippery, very strong. That's a size 4 streamer hook. I've got 30 denier thread, and I'm deflecting that hook. Now, if I pull steadily long enough, you can see I just unwound all that. It's also very slippery. So that's one of the disadvantages of this thread, is that it can be slippery, but it's incredibly strong and very small. It's not for everything. I wouldn't use it in every application, but you can use it in a lot of them. And once you get the hang of how to use it, it actually is a really nice thread. One little tidbit that I can tell you, people always ask how to cut this. When you let me get this on the hook here, if you come in and just try to cut it with your, actually that worked better than I thought. These are pretty sharp scissors. Renamids, yeah, exactly. If you go in and try to cut it with your maybe not so sharp scissors, it can be hard to snip. The way you want to cut it is just pull that tag in tight and push your scissors through it. So you're not going to snip it, you're going to push your scissors through it. Another trick to help get this thread started, or just general work with this thread, you can see if I take that piece of thread and let it loosen up, you can see that thread's kind of blown up, it's kind of frayed out. If you take your dubbing wax and run it down those last few inches, and then start your thread, that'll give it a little bit more tack, and it attaches to the hook a lot more reasonably. So a little wax on that doesn't hurt a bit. While I'm on the subject of wax, I'll talk about this. Almost all fly tying thread is waxed. To get unwaxed thread, you'd kind of have to go out of your way to do it. NanoSilk is unwaxed. I don't know why. It would seem like a good idea to wax that thread. I don't know why it is not waxed, but it would be better if it was. But almost all fly tying thread is waxed, and the wax on fly tying thread is not put there to help with your dubbing. It's you know, people all the time say, I've got wax thread, my fly tying thread's waxed, so I don't need dubbing wax. It actually has nothing to do with your dubbing. What the wax is on the thread to do. Let me get a thread that I can break here. This will work perfect. So this is 3/0 monocord. What the wax is on the thread to do. So if I'm tying along and I break my thread, see all that wants to come unwound, but it kind of binds down at the end. That wax is to keep that thread sort of bound to itself, and I didn't give that a great chance there, but it sticks the thread to itself and keeps the thread from blowing up like it does with that NanoSilk when I cut it loose. You can see when I break the ends, they stay together. So it keeps that thread from fraying. That's what the wax is for. It is not there to help you dub. You need wax on the outside of the dubbing for traction to get it twisted onto the thread in order for it to help in any case with the dubbing. So don't count on the wax on the thread to do really anything for your dubbing. Back to the NanoSilk, the sort of precursor to NanoSilk was Kevlar thread, and this is Veevus Kevlar, but Kevlar is Kevlar from any brand. It's not anything special from anybody particular. But what Kevlar is exactly what they make bulletproof vests out of. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a very strong, relatively heavy, I think this is 200 denier, yep. Only comes in one size, 200 denier. Very heavy thread that is fairly thick and very flat. Ties nice and flat on the hook, but super strong. 200 denier nano silk is going to be just as strong. This Kevlar is a little bit more, has got a little bit more bite to it, a little bit more texture to it. I like it for big deer hair stuff, hair bugs and things like that. It seems to grab the hair a little better, where nano silk, even in bigger sizes, is pretty slippery and the hair can still slide around under it. That's just my opinion on that. I like Kevlar better. It's probably because I'm old and I've always used Kevlar in those applications, but you can see that that lays really flat on the hook. One of the disadvantages to both Kevlar and nano silk is neither one hold dye very well, and you'll find that as you tie your bobbin tube may pick up some of the dye off of the thread, and very often after you've tied with the spool for a while, especially if you run your fingers over the spool, doesn't matter what color it started off as, it kind of ends up being sort of a light gray, almost to white. You can wear the dye off of it. This Kevlar, this yellow color is actually the natural color, so that's undyed. And that's the only color I ever use in this, for the reason that if I tied a big hair bug and spent an hour doing it and made it beautiful, and then I put a drop of head cement on the head on a colored thread, it would make that dye run off the thread and it would bleed through the fly. So I always use the natural color. But that's one of the disadvantages of either of those types of thread, is they don't hold dye very well. So I try to use them in just lighter colors. You can color them with a marker if you need to, just in specific spots if your thread's going to show at the head, but I've really never sweated that too much. Let's see. Obviously, we talked about the variances between brands. You know, A-dot thread from one company is not going to be the same size strength configuration as A-dot thread from another company. There's no consistency there. Don't think that if you bought a Honeycrisp apple from Safeway and you went and bought one from King Soopers that you're getting the same Honeycrisp apple. It does not work that way with thread. If you buy A-dot thread from UTC or from Uni and A-dot thread from Magpie, they're going to be very different configurations, oftentimes different materials, very little consistency between it. And like I say, that guy from Veevus, when I asked him about it, he said, what you should do is just buy a bunch of different thread and try it and see which one you like, which is really not terrible advice, especially for a guy that owns a fly shop. I think that's great advice. You should buy all the thread and tie with all of it, get it in all the colors. But realistically, you should try all of them. All thread is good for something. You'll find different ones that you like. You could get away tying everything that you ever tie with different sizes of Veevus. You could get away tying everything that you ever tie with different sizes of Uni-thread. They're all good. They're just not all good for everything. Specific uses. That polyester thread that is corded tends to have a little bit more bite to it, a little more texture to the thread. So dubbing will dub down tighter on that than it would, say, on UTC 70 denier. That's very flat like a ribbon. That's a very slick thread, and it's not that you can't dub tightly on it. It's just that the dubbing won't stick to the thread as well because the thread is so slick. Same goes for GSP. It's a very slick, very flat thread. So the texture is not going to let the dubbing adhere to it as well. Lots of little detail stuff like that. If you're right-handed and you tie with corded thread, as you wrap, you're going to make that thread even more corded, and you're going to have to manage or untwist that thread, a lot more often than you probably would like to. A flatter thread will be subject to the same amount of twist, but it doesn't start off with that amount of twist. So if you make 10 wraps, you're going to put 10 turns into a flat thread, where if you make 10 turns with a round thread right-handed, you're going to add 10 turns to what was already in there. Just to make that a little bit less clear. Hopefully that helped a little bit. Let's see, I talked about wax, round and flat, stretch. Poly has less stretch than nylon. Nylon, polyester, round and flat, all the sizes. That might be everything I know about thread. I feel like we're at about 18 and a half minutes. Am I anywhere close, Max? Not even close, huh? How long am I? Where am I? 29 minutes. I've said more than enough. You've heard enough out of me, and I have certainly heard enough out of you. Thanks for watching. If you have questions, call Max.